The silence of the homestead was a living thing, a weight that pressed in on Thaddeus Carmichael from the vast Colorado sky and rose up from the hard-packed earth to meet it. It had been a year since Margaret's passing, a year since the world had lost its color and sound, leaving only the monochrome ache of her absence. He was a ghost haunting the architecture of his own life, moving through the rooms of the small house they had built together, his hands tracing the lines of furniture her hands had chosen. Each dawn, he woke not from sleep, but from a shallow depth of exhaustion, the ghost of her warmth a cruel memory on the empty side of the bed. He was an Army veteran, a man who understood structure, discipline, and purpose. But grief had stolen all three, leaving him with only a routine of survival. Chop wood, check fences, stare at the mountains until the peaks blurred into a meaningless watercolor. Today, the silence was different. It was not empty. It was taut. The birds were quiet. The usual whisper of wind through the lodgepole pines had fallen still. Thad, standing on his porch with a mug of coffee grown cold in his hand, felt the change in the deep, instinctual part of him that had kept him alive in the Korengal Valley. It was the hush before a predator's strike, the held breath of the wild. His eyes, weary and shadowed, scanned the property line where his land bled into the national forest. Nothing. And yet the feeling persisted, a low hum beneath the quiet. He set the mug down, his movements economical, his world weariness momentarily burned away by a flicker of old alertness. It started with a smell, coppery and sharp on the clean mountain air. Blood. Not the familiar scent of a field-dressed deer, but something acrid and wrong. His gaze dropped from the horizon to the ground near the water well. The hand-crank pump, a stoic iron sentinel that had been their first victory against this wilderness, was stained. A dark, syrupy smear marred the stone base, and from it, a trail of crimson droplets led away from the house, toward the dense thicket of aspen and the shadows of the outbuildings. His mind, long fallow, began to work. A mountain lion, maybe. A big one to be so bold as to come this close to the house. Or a bear, wounded in a fight. Whatever it was injured and unpredictable, a danger he couldn't afford to ignore. He went back inside, the scrape of the screen door unnaturally loud. He bypassed the hunting rifle in the main cabinet and went to the locked footlocker beneath his bed. He pulled out the M4 carbine he'd been allowed to keep, its familiar weight a grim comfort in his hands. He worked the action, the slide and click a sound from another lifetime. It was a tool for ending things, and for a moment he felt a pang of something sour, that this was the only language he had left that felt fluent. He followed the trail. It was intermittent, a macabre breadcrumb path leading him past the woodshed and toward the old smokehouse, a squat stone structure they hadn't used in years. The smell of blood was stronger here, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of fear. The trail wasn't the steady drip of a clean wound. It was smeared, desperate, the mark of a body dragging itself through the dirt. He moved with a practiced quiet, his boots making almost no sound on the pine needles and gravel. He circled the smokehouse, placing the sun at his back, keeping the structure between himself and the unseen quarry. He was not a hunter. He was a soldier clearing a building. The instincts were the same. He rounded the final corner, rifle held at a low ready, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard. The blood trail ended at the smokehouse's dilapidated wooden door, which hung slightly ajar. He paused, listening. There was a sound from within, a ragged, wet breathing that hitched and shuddered. It wasn't the low growl of a bear or the chuff of a cat. It was something else, higher pitched, more human. A cold dread, colder than his grief, washed over him. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The interior was dark, shafts of dusty light cutting through the gaps in the roof. In the far corner, huddled against the cold stone, was the source of the sound. His mind refused to process it for a second. He had expected an animal, a beast of tooth and claw. He saw a tangle of matted, waist-length hair the color of dried leaves. He saw limbs, thin and corded with wiry muscle, smeared with dirt and dried blood. He saw eyes, wide and luminous in the gloom, that fixed on him with an intensity that was utterly primal. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was crouched on her haunches, her body coiled like a spring, one hand pressed to a ragged tear in the leather tunic she wore, a dark stain spreading from beneath her fingers. He lowered the rifle slightly, a disbelieving grunt escaping his lips. Jesus Christ. The sound of his voice, a rust-caked thing from disuse, broke the spell. The creature, the woman, reacted. A noise tore from her throat, not a word, not a scream, but a low, guttural growl that vibrated with menace and pain. Her lips peeled back from her teeth, which were sharp and white in her dirt-streaked face. Her posture shifted, her weight settling, her body language screaming a single, unequivocal message: cornered, wounded, and lethally dangerous. She was not a person in trouble. She was a predator in a trap. And in her wild, feral eyes, Thad saw no plea for help, only the promise of a fight to the death. The ghost on the homestead had just met something truly haunted, and the silence he had curated for a year had just been ripped apart by the sound of the wild breathing in his own backyard. The standoff held for a long, stretched-out minute, the dust motes dancing in the slanted light, the only movement in the small stone building. Thad's training screamed at him to see a threat, to neutralize it. But the man Margaret had loved, the man he was trying to forget he ever was, saw something else. He saw the tremor in her limbs that wasn't just aggression, but shock. He saw the pallor beneath the grime on her skin. He saw the way her breath hitched, a clear sign of a punctured lung. She was posturing, a wounded animal making itself look bigger than it was. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the M4 until its barrel pointed at the floor. He took a half-step back, raising his empty hands to show they held no threat. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and calm, the tone he'd once used to soothe a spooked horse. Her growl subsided to a suspicious rumble. Her eyes, a strange pale shade of green gold, like river stones under clear water, remained locked on his. She didn't relax, but the immediate explosive tension eased by a fraction. He saw her head tilt, a quick, bird-like gesture of assessment. It wasn't a human motion of curiosity. It was an animal calculating angles, weaknesses, the distance to his throat. He needed to get her out of the smokehouse, needed to see the wound properly. But forcing the issue would be a disaster. He held her gaze for another moment, then backed away slowly, pulling the door wider as he went, but not closing it, an offering of escape. He retreated 20 feet, his carbine now held loosely in one hand, a tool, not a weapon. He watched the dark opening of the smokehouse. Nothing. She was waiting. Smart. He walked back to the house, the silence returning, but now it was filled with a question. Who was she? Where had she come from? The tattered leather she wore wasn't from any town store. It was crudely stitched, functional, built for a life lived in the brush. He thought of old stories, of children lost in the woods, of people who simply walked away from the world. Inside, he ignored the rifle and went to the pantry. He took a strip of dried jerky, tough and salty, and filled a tin canteen with fresh water from the pump. The squeak of the handle, a loud pronouncement in the still air. He walked back toward the smokehouse and placed the offerings on a flat stone about 10 feet from the door. Then he retreated to his porch, sat on the top step, and waited. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the dusty yard. He didn't move. He just watched, his patience a thing he had relearned in the empty days. Just as he was starting to think she had slipped out the back or bled out in the dark, he saw a flicker of movement. Her head, framed by that wild mane of hair, peeked around the doorjamb. She watched the jerky. She watched him. Another 10 minutes went by. Her gaze flicked back and forth between the food and the man, an internal war playing out in the tense line of her shoulders. Hunger against fear. Finally, hunger won. She moved with a speed that was startling, a low, fluid crouch that was more coyote than human. She snatched the jerky in the canteen and was back in the shadows of the smokehouse before he could blink. The brief glimpse confirmed the severity of her injury. She moved with a stiff, painful gait, her left side held rigid. This became their new routine. 3 times a day, he would leave food and water on the stone. 3 times a day, she would dart out, snatch it, and retreat. For 2 days, this was the extent of their interaction. He began to talk to her, not expecting a reply, but just to let her grow accustomed to his voice. He told her about the weather, about the leak in the barn roof he needed to fix, about the way the aspens turned gold in the fall. He never spoke of Margaret. That name was a prayer reserved for the deepest silences. On the 3rd day, a change. After she took the food, she didn't immediately retreat. She stayed at the edge of the smokehouse's shadow, watching him, her head tilted again, that assessing animal gesture. He remained still on his porch steps. He unwrapped a piece of jerky for himself and ate it slowly, showing her it was safe. She mirrored the action, tearing at her piece with sharp, efficient teeth. They ate together, separated by 50 feet of sun-baked dirt and an immeasurable gulf of experience. He decided to risk it. He stood up slowly, keeping his movements small and predictable. "Your side," he said, his voice soft. "It needs cleaning. It'll fester." She just watched him, her expression unreadable. He went inside and returned with a bowl of warm water, clean rags, and a bottle of iodine. He set them on the stone next to where he usually left the food. He looked at her, then pointed to the items, and then to his own side. He made a gentle washing motion. "For the wound," he said. He backed away and sat down. This time the wait was longer, charged with a new kind of tension. This wasn't about food. This was about trust. An hour crawled by. The sun began its slow descent toward the jagged peaks. He thought she would refuse, that he had pushed too far. Then she emerged from the smokehouse. She walked, not ran, to the stone. She picked up the bowl, her movements still wary, but less frantic. She hesitated, looking at him, then at the open space of the yard. She took a breath, and then, instead of retreating, she sat down on the ground right there, in the open, her back to the smokehouse wall. She set the bowl down, pulled the tattered edge of her tunic aside, and finally, he saw the injury clearly. It was a deep, vicious gash, inflamed and angry, clearly made by a knife. A hunting wound. Someone had done this to her. A wave of cold fury washed over him. She dipped a rag in the water, her hands clumsy with the unfamiliar task. She flinched as she touched the wound, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. "Here," he said, unable to watch her struggle. He stood up and walked toward her, stopping a careful 10 feet away. He knelt, putting himself on her level. "Let me." Her eyes snapped to his, burning with suspicion. The low rumble started in her chest again. He held his ground, his gaze steady, his hands open and empty at his sides. He was offering a truce, a piece of himself. The next move was hers. The world seemed to hold its breath. She stared at his face, searching for something. Then, her eyes flicked down to his hands, then back to his face. The rumbling stopped. With a slow, reluctant nod, she conceded. He moved forward on his knees, closing the distance between them. The air crackled with her wildness, the scent of pine and earth and blood. He dipped a clean rag in the water, his movements slow and deliberate. "This is going to sting," he warned. He reached for her, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought she would bolt or attack. Her muscles bunched, her whole body tensing. But she held. He pressed the wet rag to the edge of her wound. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped her knee, but she made no sound. He worked in silence, cleaning the gash with a practiced efficiency that came from binding the wounds of other men in other dustier places. He poured the iodine, and she arched with a silent scream, her teeth clenched. He worked quickly, his touch gentle but firm. As he finished, laying a clean, dry cloth over the wound, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He was a mechanic fixing something broken. It was a purpose, small and immediate, but real. He was tying the makeshift bandage in place when the world broke. The sound came first, the rhythmic thud of shod hooves on the trail leading to his property. It was too fast for a casual ride, too determined. He looked up, his eyes scanning the ridge. 3 riders, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. The recurring image of his nightmares, but this time, they were real. The woman, Kestrel as he would come to know her, heard it too. Her head shot up, her body instantly transformed from a patient into a cornered animal. All the fragile trust they had built evaporated in a flash of pure terror. She scrambled backward, crab-walking toward the smokehouse, her eyes wide with a fear that was older and deeper than her pain. The lead rider reined in his horse at the edge of Thod's yard, the animal dancing nervously. The man was tall and gaunt, with a cruel twist to his mouth. Thod knew him. Caleb Brennan, a man who festered in the nearby town of Cedar Ridge like a sickness, a creature of casual malice and bottomless greed. His 2 brothers, Marcus and Owen, flanked him, dull-eyed brutes who served as Caleb's enforcers. "Carmichael!" Caleb's voice was a greasy sneer that slid through the clean air. "Fancy seeing you out and about. We were just tracking some lost property. Something of ours got hurt and ran onto your land." He wasn't looking at Thod. His eyes were scanning the property, hungry and possessive. They settled on the figure of the woman, now pressed into the shadows of the smokehouse doorway. A slow, predatory smile spread across Caleb's face. "Well, look at that. There she is, the little bitch." Thod rose to his feet, placing himself deliberately between the Brennans and the smokehouse. He felt the woman's terror like a physical blow, a desperate energy radiating from the shadows. The air, which moments ago had held the promise of a fragile peace, now tasted of violence. "She's not property, Caleb," Thod said, his voice flat and cold. "And she's on my land. That makes her my business." Caleb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your business? That ain't a woman, Carmichael, that's a thing. Found it up in the Uncompahgre. There's a $500 bounty on it, dead or alive. Seems some prospectors went missing last spring. The town thinks this little wolf killed 'em." He spat on the ground. "We'll take her. The town'll thank us for it." Thod's hand twitched, instinctively seeking the weight of the rifle he'd left inside. He was outmanned and outgunned. But he looked from Caleb's gloating, vicious face to the shadows where the woman hid, remembering the feel of her trembling under his touch, the silent bravery as he cleaned her wound. A promise he'd made to Margaret at her graveside, a whispered vow to find a reason to live again, surfaced in his mind. He hadn't understood it then, but standing here, a shield for this broken creature, he felt the first glimmer of its meaning. "No," Thod said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a thrown stone. Caleb's smile vanished. "What did you say?" "I said no," Thod repeated, his voice hardening. "You're not taking her. Get off my land." The moment stretched, thin and brittle. Marcus and Owen shifted in their saddles, their hands moving toward the pistols on their hips. Caleb's eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. He had expected a ghost, a broken man who would roll over. He had found something else. "You're making a mistake, old man," Caleb hissed. "A big one." "The only mistake," Thod said, taking a slow step toward the barn, his gaze never leaving Caleb's, "was you thinking this place was undefended." He was moving from passive widower to active protector. The choice had been made. There was no going back. From the dark of the barn, he heard a faint scrape, a sound of movement in the hayloft above. Kestrel wasn't just hiding. She was positioning herself. And in the cold certainty of the fight to come, Thod felt a part of himself he thought long dead click back into place. The grief was still there, a hollow chamber in his chest. But now, for the first time in a year, It had company, a fierce, defiant, and wholly unexpected purpose. Caleb dismounted, his movements a lazy insult. Brave words for a man who talks to ghosts. He unstrayed the bullwhip from his saddle, its leather coils dark and menacing. We tried hunting her with dogs, didn't work. We tried trapping, didn't work. We finally got close enough for me to put my mark on her, he said, gesturing vaguely with the whip toward Kestrel's hiding place. She's ours, Carmichael, by right of hunt. There's no such law, Thod stated, his mind racing, calculating angles and distances. The barn door was 10 feet behind him. Inside the barn was an old double-barreled shotgun. Not ideal, but better than his bare hands. We make our own laws out here, Caleb sneered, while Marcus and Owen fanned out, creating a fatal triangle. Last chance, step aside. Get off my land. Each word was a piece of gravel spat from his mouth. That was all it took. Caleb let out a sigh of theatrical disappointment and then struck. The whip cracked the air, a sound like a gunshot, its tip aimed not at Thod, but at the ground near his feet, kicking up a spray of dirt. It was a declaration. The negotiation was over. Thod dove for the barn. The world exploded into motion. Owen spurred his horse forward, trying to cut him off, while Marcus drew his pistol, a shot splintering the wooden doorframe just inches from Thod's head. He scrambled inside, the familiar scent of hay and dust a strange comfort. He vaulted over a stack of old crates, his hand closing around the cool, smooth stock of the shotgun propped against the wall. He broke it open. Empty. Margaret had always insisted. He fumbled in the pocket of his canvas coat, his fingers closing around the 2 heavy shells he always carried for snakes. His hands shook, not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline so potent it felt like electricity. He slammed the gun shut, the thump click of the action a definitive sound. He rose from behind the crates, just as Marcus appeared in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the bright afternoon. Thod didn't hesitate. He fired 1 barrel. The roar of the shotgun inside the enclosed space was deafening, the blast of buckshot tearing a ragged hole in the doorframe and sending Marcus staggering back with a cry of pain and surprise, his arm peppered with pellets. Son of a bitch, Caleb screamed from outside. Get him! Get him now! Thod retreated deeper into the barn's gloom, using the stalls and old farm equipment as cover. He knew the Brennans. They were bullies, not soldiers. Their rage would make them sloppy. He could hear Owen circling the building on horseback, looking for another way in. A shot rang out from the front, a bullet thudding into the thick timber wall of a stall near his head. He crouched, reloading the spent barrel, his mind a cold, clear machine. He was back in the Korangal, the smell of hay replaced with dust and cordite, the Colorado sun with the unforgiving Afghan heat. He had to keep them separated. He had to control the engagement. Then he remembered Kestrel. He glanced up at the hayloft. In the chaos, he'd lost track of her. He expected her to be gone, to have used the fight as a diversion to flee into the wilderness that was her home. But a flicker of movement in the shadows above told him she was still there. He saw the pale oval of her face, her wild eyes staring down not with terror, but with a chilling, predatory focus. She was watching the fight unfold, her head tilted in that now familiar way, assessing, learning. Owen found a weak point, a wide, unboarded window on the barn's far side. He swung himself from his horse, his heavy frame filling the opening. He had his pistol out, his dull eyes scanning the darkness. I see you, Carmichael, he bellowed, taking a step inside. Thod was pinned. Caleb and Marcus were at the front. Owen was now inside, flanking him. It was over. He gripped the shotgun, preparing to make a final, desperate stand. And then, from above, came the whisper of movement. It wasn't a sound of fear, it was the sound of launch. Kestrel didn't climb down the ladder. She didn't scream for help. She leaped. A 20-foot drop from the hayloft to the barn floor. She didn't fall. She flew, a streak of tattered leather and feral grace, her body an arrow aimed at Owen Brennan's back. She hit him like a striking hawk, a silent, shocking impact. There was no war cry, just the thud of her body colliding with his and a strangled grunt of surprise from the big man. Her thin arms wrapped around his thick neck, her legs scissoring around his waist, her weight and momentum bringing him crashing forward onto his face. The pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the dirt floor. Owen roared, a sound of pain and outrage, trying to buck her off. But she was a whirlwind of primal fury. He was bigger, stronger, but he was a man fighting. She was an animal surviving. She bit into his shoulder, her teeth sinking deep, and he screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony. He flailed, trying to grab her, but she was like smoke and fury. Her hands, tipped with nails like claws, raked across his face, leaving deep, bleeding gouges. Thod stared for a fraction of a second, stunned. She was not a victim to be protected. She was a force of nature to be unleashed. The entire dynamic of the fight had just been rewritten. The distraction was all he needed. He burst from cover, rounding the stall and leveling the shotgun at Caleb, who was peering into the barn, his face a mask of confusion at his brother's screams. Caleb's eyes widened in panic as he saw Thod. He tried to bring his own pistol around, but he was too slow. "Drop it!" Thod commanded, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't felt in years. Caleb, seeing the twin black holes of the shotgun barrels, let his pistol fall to the dirt. Behind him, Marcus was clutching his bleeding arm, his face pale with shock. Inside, the terrible sounds of Kestrel's assault on Owen had subsided. Owen lay groaning on the floor, curled into a ball, while Kestrel stood over him, her chest heaving, her face and hands smeared with his blood. Her eyes found Thod's across the barn, and in them he saw not madness, but a fierce, terrible clarity. She had defended their ground. "Get him!" Thod snarled at Caleb, nodding toward the whimpering Owen. "And get off my property. If I ever see you or your brothers on this land again, I will not miss." Caleb, his arrogance shattered, scrambled to obey. He and a wounded Marcus dragged the blubbering, bleeding Owen out of the barn and hoisted him onto his horse. Caleb shot one last look at Thod, a look of pure, undiluted hatred that promised this was far from over. Then he turned his horse and galloped away, his brothers trailing miserably behind him. The sound of their hoofbeats faded, replaced by the ringing in Thod's ears and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The immediate threat was gone. He looked at Kestrel. She stood in a shaft of light, streaked with dirt and blood, her wild hair falling around a face that was terrifying and magnificent. She was not the wounded creature he had found. She was not the shy recipient of his charity. She was a survivor, a warrior. And in that moment, standing together in the bloody aftermath, Thod understood that his life had not just been given a purpose. It had been irrevocably entwined with hers. The quiet of the homestead was gone for good, replaced by the savage, ringing echo of a battle won together. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a bone-deep tremor in its wake. The barn was a wreck, splintered wood and scattered hay bearing witness to the violence. Owen Brennan's pistol lay in the dirt, a forgotten relic of the clash. Thod picked it up, ejected the cylinder, and pocketed the bullets before tossing the useless metal aside. He looked at Kestrel. She hadn't moved from her position over the defeated Brennan, her body still humming with a lethal energy. Blood, not her own, was smeared on her cheek and knuckles. "It's over," Thod said, his voice hoarse. "They're gone." Her gaze shifted from the empty doorway to him. The ferocity in her eyes softened, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. She looked down at her hands, at the foreign blood on them, and a flicker of something, confusion, perhaps revulsion, crossed her face. She took a staggering step back from Owen's bloodstain on the floor, as if just now realizing what she had done. He closed the distance between them, moving slowly. He didn't reach for her, not yet. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, a slight jerky motion. Then she looked at the long, bloody scratches on his forearm, where he'd brushed against the splintered door frame. Before he could react, she stepped forward, her former hesitation gone, replaced by a new, focused intensity. She took his arm gently, her touch surprisingly delicate. She examined the wounds, her brow furrowed. Then she looked around the barn, her eyes landing on a sack of feed. She walked over, tore a strip from the burlap with her teeth, and brought it to the water trough. She dipped it in the cool water and returned to him, dabbing at the blood with a focused quiet. They stood there in the dusty light, a silent, reversed ritual of care. He had tended her wound. Now she tended his. It was a language without words, an affirmation sealed in the shared experience of combat. Trust, he realized, wasn't just built on gentleness. It was forged in the fire of a common enemy. They spent the rest of the evening in a state of watchful quiet. They secured the barn door, cleaned themselves at the water pump, a silent, necessary cleansing, and sat on the porch as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky. He cooked bacon and eggs on the cast-iron skillet, and she ate with him at the small kitchen table, her initial animalistic hunger replaced by a slow, deliberate curiosity, watching how he used his fork, how he held his mug. A fragile domesticity was settling over the homestead, a strange and precious thing born from chaos. But peace, Thad knew, was a temporary condition. Caleb Brennan was not a man to accept defeat. He was poison, and he would seep back into their lives one way or another. The second wave of riders came 2 days later, just after dawn. Thad saw them cresting the hill first, the morning sun glinting off a star-shaped badge. It was Sheriff Watson, and behind him, a grim-faced posse of a half-dozen men from Cedar Ridge, armed with rifles and a self-righteous fury. The town itself had come to call. Kestrel, who had been sitting on the porch steps, watching a column of ants, went rigid. The sound of that many horses was a trigger. She shot to her feet and melted back into the house, a shadow disappearing into other shadows. Thad met them in the yard, his shotgun held loosely at his side, barrel down. He looked past Watson at the other faces, ranchers and storekeepers he'd known for years, their expressions now closed and hostile. "Thad," Watson said, his voice firm, but not unkind. He was a man who believed in the letter of the law, a rigid morality that left little room for nuance. "I've got a complaint sworn out by Caleb Brennan. Assault, attempted murder. He's saying you and that thing you're harboring tried to kill him and his brothers." "Caleb and his brothers were on my land, armed, threatening me," Thad countered, his voice level. "I defended myself and my property. You'll find one of their pistols in the dirt in my barn. As for the girl, they wounded her and were hunting her for a bounty. That's not law, Watson. That's a lynching." A man in the posse, a store owner named Peters, spat on the ground. "That ain't a girl. It's the wild thing that killed the Miller prospectors. We all know it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the other men. They saw a monster, a scapegoat for their fears of the vast, untamable wilderness that surrounded their small pocket of civilization. "You have any proof of that?" Thad challenged, his gaze sweeping over them. "Or just Caleb's word? The word of a man who'd skin his own mother for $1? "We have his word, and his brother's injuries," Watson said, his face inflexible. "The law is the law. Right now, all I see is a man harboring a dangerous fugitive. I need you to turn her over, Thad. We'll take her back to town, and it'll be sorted out proper." "Sorted out how?" Thad shot back, his anger rising. "In a cage? To be gawked at and stoned? You know as well as I do what will happen to her. She won't survive it." He was pleading now, trying to make them see past their fear. "She's not what you think. She's just a person. She's been alone, that's all." As if summoned by his words, the front door of the house creaked open. Kestrel stood in the doorway. She wasn't hiding. Her face was clean, her hair brushed back. She wore a plain cotton shirt of Margaret's that he had given her. It was too big, but it was clean. It made her look less like a creature of the forest and more like what she was, a young woman. She looked at the posse, her eyes wide but resolute. She had heard them talking about her, heard the venom and the fear. She looked at Thad, at the desperate fight in his eyes. Then she did something that stunned every man there into silence. She pointed a finger at her own chest. Kez. Trell, she said. The word was broken, raspy from disuse, but it was clear. A name. Her name. It was a declaration of self, a defiant claim of humanity in the face of their judgment. The posse shifted, some men looking away, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. For a moment, a fragile, impossible moment, Thod thought it might be enough. Watson himself seemed taken aback, his rigid certainty wavering. The moment was shattered by the arrival of the third wave. Another 2 riders crested the hill, moving at a fast clip. One was Caleb Brennan, his face a mask of triumphant spite. The other was a man in a crisp suit and a city hat, a stranger. As they drew closer, Thod saw the glint of a badge on his vest. But it wasn't a local one. It was larger, more official, federal. Sheriff Watson, the stranger said, reining in his horse. His voice was cold and clipped, a voice of Eastern bureaucracy. Marshal Hayes, I have a federal warrant for the fugitive known as Jane Doe, wanted for questioning in the murder of 2 federal surveyors on government land last year. He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. This warrant gives me authority to take her into custody. This is now a federal matter. Caleb's vindictive smile was all the confirmation Thod needed. The prospectors had become federal surveyors. The story had been embellished, elevated to a level that a local sheriff couldn't ignore and a local posse couldn't fight. It was a brilliant, malevolent lie. All hope seemed to drain out of the world. The law, in its highest and most impartial form, had arrived, and it was built on a fiction designed to kill her. Marshal Hayes dismounted, his eyes cold and assessing. I will be taking the woman. Thod's mind was a maelstrom. He had no weapon that could fight this, no argument. The law was absolute. He looked at Kestrel, standing in the doorway, her brave, fragile declaration of her name now meaningless. He saw the trap closing, the cage, the end of her wild, fierce life. He thought of Margaret, of his promise. Find a reason to live. And he knew, with a certainty that burned away all fear, that his reason was standing right there. To save her was to save himself. And then, in a moment of pure, desperate invention, a lie so monumental it might just work, he found his weapon. He stepped forward, putting himself between the marshal and Kestrel. He looked not at Hayes, but directly at Sheriff Watson, whose face was a mixture of relief and regret. Marshal, Thod's voice was perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You can't take this woman. Hayes's eyebrow arched. And why is that, Mr. Carmichael? Thod held Watson's gaze, pinning him with the lie before it was even spoken. Because you can't arrest a man's wife on the unsubstantiated claims of a bounty hunter. He paused, letting the words sink into the stunned silence. He then turned his head slightly, a gesture of inclusion. Isn't that right, Sheriff? You were here. You were a witness. The world stopped. The wind died. The posse stared, slack-jawed. Caleb's triumphant smirk dissolved into disbelief. She is my wife, Thod declared, his voice ringing with the absolute conviction of a man with nothing left to lose. Margaret Kestrel Carmichael. We were married by a traveling preacher last week. Sheriff Watson happened to be riding by and stood as our witness. He had laid the trap. He had made Watson the embodiment of local law and order, the foundation of his lie. To deny it, Watson would have to admit to a federal marshal that a violent feud involving assault and attempted murder had erupted under his nose, and he hadn't known a thing about it until days later. He would look incompetent, a small-town fool. Or he could take the path of least resistance, swallow the lie, and make this entire federal problem disappear from his jurisdiction. Thod saw the calculation in the sheriff's eyes, the struggle between his inflexible code and the political reality of the moment. Marshal Hayes turned his cold gaze on Watson. Sheriff, is this true? The silence stretched for an eternity. Watson looked from Thod's unflinching stare to Kestrel's wide, confused eyes, to Caleb's sputtering rage, and finally, to the impatient, waiting Marshall. Watson cleared his throat. He straightened in his saddle, his face a stony mask. "That's right, Marshall," he said, the words sounding like they were dragged over gravel. "I was here. I saw it." The lie was complete. It hung in the air, solid and real, a shield forged from desperation and audacity. Thod had taken their civilization, their laws, their bureaucracy, and turned it back on them like a weapon. He had forced them to see Kestrel not as a thing to be hunted, but as a person protected by the very rules they sought to use against her. Marshall Hayes stood for a long moment, his sharp eyes flicking between Thod, Kestrel, and the now fuming Caleb. He was no fool. He could likely smell the lie, feel its texture in the strained air, but it was a legally perfect lie, corroborated by the highest lawman in the county. To challenge it would mean paperwork, hearings, a jurisdictional mess. His warrant was for a Jane Doe, a fugitive. The woman in the doorway was now Mrs. Carmichael, a citizen, vouched for by a sheriff. With a sigh that was pure bureaucratic frustration, Hayes folded the warrant and tucked it back into his coat. "It seems there has been a mistake." He turned to Caleb Brennan, his voice dropping to an icy threat. "And be warned, Mr. Brennan. Wasting federal time and resources by filing false claims carries its own severe penalties." Caleb's face went white. He opened his mouth to protest, but the marshal's glare silenced him. Defeated, seething with a rage that had no outlet, Caleb yanked his horse's reins and rode away, not with a gallop, but with the slow, grinding retreat of a man utterly vanquished. Marshal Hayes gave a curt nod to Thod. "Mr. Carmichael, ma'am." He mounted his horse and, without another word, trotted back up the trail, leaving a bewildered and muttering posse in his wake. One by one, the men from town turned their horses, avoiding Thod's eyes. They had come for a monster and had been confronted with a marriage certificate, however invisible. Their certainty was broken, replaced by a confusing mixture of doubt and grudging respect. Sheriff Watson was the last to leave. He paused, looking at Thod, a complex expression on his face. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a concession, an acknowledgement, a truce, and then followed his men, leaving the homestead in a profound and ringing silence. They were alone. Thod felt the strength go out of his legs, leaning against the porch railing for support. The monumental gamble had paid off. He turned and looked at Kestrel, who was still standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. She had understood not the words, but the intent. She had seen him build a fortress around her, with nothing but air and audacity. She walked slowly toward him, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch. She stopped just before him, looking up into his face. Her head tilted, not in animal assessment, not even in simple curiosity, but in deep, human contemplation. She was processing the impossible thing that had just happened. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched his chest, right over his heart. Then, she tested the new word, the one that had saved her, her voice a soft, questioning whisper. "Wife?" Thod covered her hand with his own. His throat was tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He nodded slowly. Yes. A small, wondering smile touched her lips. Her eyes, the color of river stones, held his. She then pointed a finger at him, at his heart. "Hus." "Band?" she asked, the two syllables a question, a discovery, and a beginning. He looked out at the mountains, at the vast, wild land that had almost taken her and had almost buried him. The ghost was gone. He was no longer just a widower, a veteran, a man haunting his own life. He was a husband. The lie had become the truth. 6 months passed. The lie settled into the foundations of their lives, becoming a strange and sacred truth that only they understood. Winter draped the high country in a blanket of silence, a different kind of quiet from the one that had once haunted the homestead. This silence was peaceful, shared. It was the quiet of two people moving in comfortable orbit around each other. the sound of snow falling on pine boughs, and the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth. The story of the mad marriage of Thaddeus Carmichael spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, whispered over store counters and saloon bars. The townsfolk, their fear replaced by a potent cocktail of awe and envy, gave the homestead a wide berth. They spoke of the wild woman Thad had tamed, not understanding that it was he who was being brought back to life. They were a local legend, a mystery on the edge of town, a story that was part wildness, part love, and entirely their own. Kestrel learned. The world, which had once been a map of threats and resources, began to fill with names, with concepts. She learned the word spoon, and then how to hold it. She learned the word blanket, and then the comfort of its weight. Thad taught her to read, starting with simple words scratched into the dirt with a stick. Her mind was a fertile wilderness, and language was the seed. She absorbed it all with a fierce, joyful intelligence. Her speech remained spare, functional, but her understanding was profound. In turn, she taught him. She taught him the language of the forest, the meaning of a jay's sharp call, the way the wind smelled before a snowstorm. She showed him which roots were sweet and which mushrooms were poison. She taught him how to move through the woods without a sound, to be a part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. He was a soldier who knew how to survive in a hostile land, but she taught him how to live in a generous one. His grief for Margaret did not vanish. It changed. It became a quiet foundational stone in his heart, no longer a source of pain, but a source of strength. He spoke of her to Kestrel, telling stories of their life together. Kestrel would listen, her head tilted in that gesture that had transformed from animal instinct to deep contemplation, and she would touch the silver locket he always wore, understanding that this memory was a part of the man who had become her anchor. Their home was a fusion of two worlds. Inside there was the warmth of the fire, the smell of baking bread, and the soft murmur of lessons in reading and speaking. Outside, there was the wild, untamed beauty of the mountains. They were neither fully civilized nor fully wild. They were something new, something forged together. The water well, the site of their first encounter, became a place of quiet ritual. They would pump water together, her hands over his, on the cold iron handle. They washed vegetables from the small garden she had learned to tend, her hands, once claw-like, now gentle as they scrubbed the dirt from a potato. It was a place of cleansing, of life, a symbol of the home they had built. One evening in early spring, as the last of the snow melted from the high peaks and the world smelled of damp earth and new beginnings, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn a soft, bruised rose. Kestrel, who now wore her hair in a simple braid, leaned her head against his shoulder. A comfortable silence settled between them. "Thad," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Yes?" "The riders," she said, looking toward the hill where the Brennans, the posse, and the marshal had all appeared, a recurring nightmare made real. "They do not come back." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of a peace she was still learning to trust. "No," he said, putting his arm around her. "They won't be back. This is our land, our home." She looked up at him, her riverstone eyes reflecting the last light of the day. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile he had earned, a smile that was the very definition of peace. "Our home," she repeated, testing the words, finding them true. He was no longer a ghost, and she was no longer just a survivor. They were partners, a husband and a wife, bound not by law or convention, but by a lie that had saved them both, and a trust that had been built one scar, one word, one shared silence at a time. The world could whisper its stories, but here, on this small patch of land between the wilderness and the town, they had forged their own language, their own law, and their own hard-earned, beautiful peace.